future of communications will dominate the world.
By early 2020, China's tech giant Huawei is poised to deploy most of the world's 5G infrastructure.
China probably has its single most effective lobbying operation in Brussels.
Beijing has offered them extremely attractive terms, is really offering a massive subsidization of their 5G rollouts.
But there is a problem.
I am announcing that a grand jury in Seattle has returned an indictment that alleges 10 federal crimes by 2 affiliates of Telecommunications Corporation Huawei Technology.
If our businesses are being robbed every time they step overseas, if our rivals can cheat their way ahead in the global race for innovation, you bet our security will suffer. I've been blessed with the American dream. My life's work has been focused on creating innovative companies by building high-performance teams and then empowering them to pursue opportunities and accomplish things they never imagined possible.
China wants Huawei to dominate the world. They'll find a way to do it unless we are tough as could be.
The United States has developed a comprehensive approach to address long-term threat to data privacy posed to the free world from authoritarian malign actors. It's called the Clean Network.
Welcome to Zooming in China. I'm Simone Gao. In our last episode, we talked about former Undersecretary of State Keith Krach, who came from a small town in Ohio, turned into a tech titan, and in March 2020 was given the urgent mission to rescue the U.S.'s previously failed attempts of defeating CCP's master plan for controlling the future of 5G communications. Krach believed the same leadership principles and strategies he used so effectively in building category kings and massive networks in Silicon Valley could be applied in economic statecraft against an increasingly aggressive China Inc. By applying these tactics, he led his team to achieve a 5G trifecta that put Huawei, China's 5G equipment provider, on the defensive by essentially cutting off their chip supply, and they had to sell their cell phone business. Huawei has close ties to the Chinese military and poses a national security threat to countries who use its equipment. But the trifecta was just the opening salvo of reversing Huawei's momentum. Their 5G deployment was still going strong. Before the trifecta was announced, Huawei had secured 91 5G contracts globally. Krach knew that the effort to stop Huawei had to go beyond the American efforts alone. In his Senate confirmation testimony, Krach outlined his clean network strategy to address the China challenge.
I said I would harness the U.S.'s comparative advantage in 3 areas: further strengthen our relationship with our allies and our friends, leverage the innovation and resources of the private sector, and amplify the moral high ground of democratic values.
The Clean Network turned out to be the exact place where these strategies would be applied. Will the U.S. win the battle? Can an all-American dream beat China Inc. in the 21st century? And most importantly, will the Clean Network usher in a new economic order, not just between the United States and China, but for the entire world? Let's start this episode with a surprising announcement from the United Kingdom in January 2020.
Now, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has decided that Chinese tech giant Huawei will be granted a limited role in building the UK's 5G mobile network.
The British public deserve to have access to the best possible technology. I've talked about infrastructure and technology. If people oppose one brand or another, then they have to tell us what's the alternative, right? On the other hand, let's be clear. I don't want, as the UK Prime Minister, to put in any infrastructure that is going to prejudice our national security or our ability to cooperate with Five Eyes intelligence.
Britain did have some precautionary measures to address the security issues. For example, The UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, put in place a Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Center, which published the annual reports for Huawei. In 2020, after reviewing the company's source code, the Oversight Board concluded that it could only provide limited assurance that all risks to UK national security from Huawei's involvement in the UK's critical networks can be sufficiently mitigated long-term. Boris Johnson went ahead with allowing Huawei into the UK despite this report. America was not impressed.
We just don't believe that utilizing the assets, the technology of Huawei is consistent with the security or privacy interests of the UK, of the United States, and it remains a real issue between our two countries.
Secretary Pompeo visited his counterpart in London. A bipartisan group of U.S. senators urged Parliament to reconsider the decision. America's export control put extra pressure on the Johnson administration. Why did the UK turn its backs on America's warning? Some observers pointed out that China's investment in two major projects in the UK played a heavy role. Specifically, China General Nuclear Power Group was involved in constructing several nuclear plants for the UK, and China Railway Construction Corp was funding a high-speed rail link in the country, a key initiative for the Johnson government. Another big reason was that in Europe, the telecom industry's lobbying for Huawei was very strong. I had an interview with Ruvada Networks CEO Declan Ganley about that situation.
The carrier lobbies in each of these countries have done all of the lobbying with not an awful lot of need for help from Beijing. And the reason that they're doing that lobbying is Beijing has offered them extremely attractive terms, is really offering a massive subsidization of their 5G rollouts. And these carriers who are trying to maintain the market, the margin between what they retail a gigabyte of information, of data for, and the cost that it costs to produce it, while they want to maintain this retail business model, they need these Chinese subsidies. And so they are addicted.
Geopolitical expert John Sidelites echoed Ganley's opinion.
China probably has its single most effective lobbying operation in Brussels than anywhere else in the world. They have deployed thousands of business people and everyday citizens who are operating in Brussels to be able to lobby European Union bureaucracies, bureaucrats, nationals from different EU countries in an effort to expand Huawei into European markets and also the Belt Road Initiative.
Because of the European telcos' strong inclination to use Huawei, it turned out that even before their governments made any decisions on the Chinese company, the telcos had started deploying 5G with Huawei equipment. For example, Germany held its 5G spectrum license auction in early 2019. Major German mobile carriers that bought those licenses started deploying 5G with Huawei equipment regardless of any government decision. Exactly the same thing had happened in the UK.
They're so confident of their regulatory capturability and of their relationships and of the power of those relationships that they feel confident enough to say, we're going to make this decision, we're going to do this rollout anyway, and whoever becomes the next democratic leader, it doesn't matter what they think, because we are so embedded and we're so powerful and our lobby has got such reach that no one will dare to make us reverse our decision and or make us have to undo the fact that we've created these facts on the ground and deployed Huawei 5G.
But there is just one problem with that confidence: possible public opinion shifts on Huawei and China that will put tremendous pressure on telcos and governments to change their decision. And that's exactly what happened. On May 28, 2020, after 1 year of brutal crackdown on Hong Kongers' protest against the Chinese extradition law that would erode Hong Kong's freedom, China imposed a national security legislation on Hong Kong to tackle secession, subversion, terrorism, and foreign interference. This law effectively ended China's promise to the one country, two systems. That was stated in the Sino-British Joint Declaration when the UK handed Hong Kong to Beijing in 1997. The next day, President Donald Trump announced this.
China's latest incursion, along with other recent developments that degraded the territory's freedoms, makes clear that Hong Kong is no longer sufficiently autonomous to warrant the special treatment that we have afforded the territory since the handover. China has replaced its promised formula of one country, two systems with one country, one system. Therefore, I am directing my administration to begin the process of eliminating policy exemptions that give Hong Kong different and special treatment.
America's swift response served as a weather vane for the free world. Now all eyes are on Europe, the United Kingdom in particular. By then, Keith Krach and his team had already conducted a global listening tour to find out how countries really felt about Huawei.
I've probably had 80 bilateral meetings with my foreign counterparts, ministers of finance or economics. And I'll say, how's your relationship going with China? What's it like? And they'll go, whatever important, they're a big trading partner. And then they'll lean in, they'll look both ways. This would be a bilateral meeting. They go, but we don't trust them.
Governments fear China. Telcos are addicted to Chinese subsidies, but no one trusts China, according to Krach. His game plan? Hitting the target one by one and doing it at a lightning speed.
Speed now is the #1 currency in business today. And you need momentum for that digital transformation. And the big, they no longer eat the small. The quick eat the slow. The future of your company depends on it. It depends on action now, not 1 year from now. And success needs no explanation. Failure needs no alibi. Failure's not an option. It's go time.
Krach launched a three-pronged global campaign to sign up clean countries, clean telcos, and clean companies. In order to demonstrate early momentum in building the network, the team started by aligning with countries that already excluded Huawei while simultaneously approaching CEOs of the telecommunications giants. By the end of May, Poland, Australia, Denmark, Norway, New Zealand, Israel, Latvia, and Czech Republic were already members of the Clean Network. But there would be no turning of the tide if America's #1 ally was playing ball with Huawei. In June 2020, the political wind in Britain was changing fast after the national security law about Hong Kong was passed by China.
London was really upset by the PRC's crackdown in Hong Kong and incredibly disturbed by its lack of transparency about the pandemic outbreak. And the British government was also facing, at that time, a political rebellion by the UK's ruling Conservative Party. And that was about, of course, the Chinese involvement in the country's 5G network. And the new export restrictions that we put on Huawei semiconductors under the 5G trifecta proved to be a catalyst for their reassessment. So right around this time, Beijing was starting to feel desperate. And that's when they reverted to their bullying tactics.
China's ambassador to the UK, Liu Xiaoming, warned Prime Minister Johnson that any ban would send a very bad message, and it was not in the UK's interest to make an enemy of Beijing.
If you want to make China a hostile country, you have to bear the consequences.
Liu warned that severing ties with Huawei could prompt Beijing to pull Chinese investment from major British infrastructure projects. Secretary Pompeo responded by issuing a statement saying the United States stands with our allies and partners against the CCP's coercive bullying tactics. The Telegraph published an op-ed by Keith Krach by the title, "The Free World Must Unite Against Huawei."
UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab recently remarked that it isn't just the devastation of COVID-19 that takes the shine off of China, but also the fact that the CCP doesn't live up to the deals that it makes, The crackdown on Hong Kong is a case in point. As the Foreign Secretary Rob said, it comes down to an issue of trust. Why would anyone trust them with other deals they might make?
On July 14, a week after Liu's warning, Britain announced that the UK mobile providers are being banned from buying new Huawei 5G equipment after December 31st, and the future of the UK's 5G will also exclude Huawei.
We have concluded that it is necessary and indeed prudent to commit to a timetable for the removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G network by 2027.
The UK decision to exclude Huawei was an important step in beginning to turn the tide against the Chinese company. Countries and companies were now asking themselves whether Huawei could be trusted and what the consequences would be to keep using Huawei. More chips were about to fall. A week after the UK ban, France announced its plan to phase out Huawei. The tide on the European continent was beginning to turn. In July and August of 2020, while Huawei was losing some of its momentum in Europe after the UK and France defeat, Krach and team decided to double down and began to further leverage the Clean Network with 5 new lines of effort. On August 5th, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo officially expanded the scope of the Clean Network.
In April, I announced our team's Clean Path initiative to keep Americans' data safe from untrusted vendors. Today, I'm pleased to announce the expansion of the Clean Network with the launch of 5 new lines of effort. I'll walk through them quickly. First, Clean Carrier. We're working to ensure that untrusted Chinese telecom companies don't provide international telecommunication services between the United States and foreign destinations. Second, we call Clean Store. We want to see untrusted Chinese apps removed from U.S. app stores. Third, Clean Apps. We're working to prevent Huawei and other untrusted vendors from pre-installing or making available for download the most popular U.S. apps. Fourth, Clean Cloud. We're protecting Americans' most sensitive personal information and our businesses' most valuable intellectual property, including COVID vaccine research, from being accessed on cloud-based systems run by companies such as Alibaba, Baidu, China Mobile, China Telecom, and Tencent. Fifth and finally, Clean Cable. We're working to ensure that the CCP can't compromise information carried by the undersea cables that connect our country and others to the global internet. We call on all freedom-loving nations and companies to join the Clean Network.
By August 10th, 2020, the Clean Network grew to 30 clean countries and territories, along with some of the largest telecommunications companies, including Orange in France, Reliance in India, Telstra in Australia, SK and KT in Korea, NTT in Japan, O2 in the UK, and all telcos in Canada, Norway, Vietnam, and Taiwan. On August 24th, 2020, India phased out equipment from Chinese companies from its telecoms networks. On September 22nd, 2020, Undersecretary Krach embarked on an official trip to Europe. This time, the goal was to build a transatlantic clean network.
The other key thing is the fastest way to build a network is a network of networks. So on my first European trip, the first stop was NATO. So I met with Deputy Secretary General Giuliani, and I go into his office. He goes, "We need a clean NATO network." He goes, "We can't have, some countries in the transatlantic alliance that have trusted networks and some untrusted. You see, we need those 5G civilian networks in peacetime or wartime. We can't have a fractured alliance." So he was a great ally, and he was right there in Brussels. The next day, I went to go see my friend, EU Commissioner Thierry Breton. I knew him when he was CEO of Bull and CEO of French Telecom before it was Orange.
Commissioner Thierry Breton had just led the member states in developing the EU 5G Clean Toolbox. Krach and Breton issued a joint statement on the synergies between the Clean Network and the EU 5G Clean Toolbox, stating that the toolbox fit the criteria for inclusion in the Clean Network.
He came up with a thing called the 5G EU Cybersecurity Toolbox. Basically, he identified who are the trusted suppliers, which were really the Europeans and Koreans, and basically anything but the Chinese, right? ZTE or Huawei. And then he identified the high-risk suppliers. Telcos in Europe, their board of directors have to make the 5G supplier decision. And if they choose a high-risk supplier and something goes wrong, they are personally liable for 4% of the damages or 20 million, whichever is higher. I've been on a lot of boards. That's when you go under the desk in a fetal position, right? We certainly appreciate the endorsement here today by the 3 Seas nations for the Blue Dot Network and the Clean Network.
Krach and his team had pulled it off with another trifecta by integrating NATO, the EU, and the 3 Seas coalition of nations into the Clean Network. It was a giant step forward in building the network effect, but more importantly, it now became undeniable that the Clean Network was not an American alone approach. Plus, the liability terms in the EU 5G Clean Toolbox is a powerful measure to rein in telcos lobbying for China. The tide was turning against Huawei. This was exactly the momentum Krach's team would need if they had any hope of winning over Europe's toughest and the most important customer.
Europe has become the focal point of that campaign, and in particular, Germany. Can Berlin really afford to sit on the fence on this issue for much longer?
China was Germany's biggest export market, especially for the automotive industry. Germany was also a key market for Huawei's expansion, and its political influence in Europe made a partnership valuable. Germany's Chinese ambassador Wu said, if Germany were to take a decision that leads to Huawei's exclusion from the German market, there will be consequences. The Chinese government will not stand idly by. German automakers account for a quarter of the 28 million cars sold in China. Can we say that German cars are not safe because we're in a position to manufacture our own cars? German commentators took Wu's remarks as an open threat. But what could be an effective counterpunch? Lan Khodorkovsky is the chief marketing officer for the Clean Network. He was a Madison Avenue advertising executive.
Before meeting with the German government officials, we leveraged Undersecretary Krach's trusted customer relationships with more than 20 top CEOs in Munich, Frankfurt, Cologne. Our approach was really based on moral high ground of democratic values, treating governments like customers and the media with humility.
I remember going over to Germany and talking to the press, and they said, well, what happens if we don't join the Clean Network? What's America going to do to us? And I said, this decision is for the people of Germany to decide. And we respect whatever Germany decides. And they said, well, why should we do it? And I go, German Basic Law, Article 1, because that's their constitution that they developed in 1949. And German Basic Law, Article 1, is 2 words, really. It's human dignity. It's the duty and the responsibility of the German government is human dignity. And I said, Huawei is the backbone for China's surveillance state. This is a tool that only the worst of dictators could have dreamed of. And this is what's responsible for all the human rights abuses, all the things that are going on in the surveillance state, all the stuff that's going on in Xinjiang where they're committing genocide. Then I saw what the press wrote. Krach's a different diplomat, than what we're used to. But I think you really got to speak in those terms. The other thing, too, in Germany was that I had known so many CEOs from DocuSign and Ariba, so they were my friends. I'd been on the stage with many of them.
Keith got a surprise. Tim.
What is that, Keith?
And this is the DocuSign Digital Hero Award.
Come on.
And by the way, it's no small award, as you can see, for being a role model partner of digital leadership, innovation, and trust. Tim Hodges, you have the trophy. You are a great, great role model partner. We can't thank you enough. Everything that you've done for DocuSign, Europe, Germany, and the world.
Thank you very much. Guys.
What was the rationale you used with your friend Tim Hodges and other German CEOs about Huawei?
One thing I'd always talk about, because I also have German roots, Germany sets the standard in terms of Data privacy, security, quality, reliability, precision. They set the standard of the world. If you're utilizing Huawei in your 5G system, you just drop that golden standard. So it was really more an approach like that.
4 days later, Germany prepared legislation that would effectively ban Huawei from its 5G network. A senior security official described Germany's strategy to Huawei as strangled in red tape. Team USA had accomplished their German mission. The tide would turn faster now in Europe. But the team was tempting a dangerous fate. COVID cases were ramping up rapidly throughout Europe.
The team was moving at lightning speed at this point, covering 20 cities in 15 countries, meeting with heads of state, telco CEOs, business leaders, other government officials, and the goal was always to build a transatlantic clean network. I'll never forget when we pulled off an unprecedented diplomatic feat. Undersecretary Krach signed a trifecta of clean network agreements with prime ministers of North Macedonia, Kosovo, Bulgaria, all in one day. We were on a roll. And then the next day, we were notified that the Prime Minister of Bulgaria came down with COVID. Keith immediately canceled our next stop in Saudi Arabia, telling us my #1 responsibility is your safety. He chartered a plane personally on the spot and got us back home, and thankfully nobody tested positive.
The adoption of the Clean Network principles by the EU, NATO, 3Cs, and a growing number of European countries solidifies its credibility as a multinational initiative. The Clean Network had now become a transatlantic clean network. Its membership consisted of 26 out of 27 EU nations, 27 out of 30 NATO members, 11 out of 12 3Cs countries, and 31 out of 37 OECD members. The success of the Clean Network turned into an effective security blanket against the CCP's retaliation. After additional visits to Egypt, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, the Clean Network grew to 49 clean countries, more than 100 clean telcos. The tide had turned. They had taken the momentum away from Huawei. But Huawei was not giving up. They had planned a counter-offensive, and Team USA was heading into an ambush. Brazil, with a population of 211 million, is the largest country in South America. Similar to Germany in Europe, Brazil had the biggest influence on the rest of the South American nations' decision to join the Clean Network and would be the most challenging, since Huawei had staked out a strong position with the Brazilian government. Krach decided to go straight to Sao Paulo to the CEOs of the telcos. By now, Krach was adept at convincing CEOs. However, there was just one big problem.
As we were in the air flying down, we learned that Huawei had somehow convinced Brazilian telcos not to participate in our previously scheduled meetings. It was everywhere in the South American press, and it was going to be a PR nightmare for us. We needed a plan B, and fortunately, our Brazilian ambassador, Todd Chapman, already began implementing a plan B. He was the Undersecretary's former senior advisor, and he understood the approach of utilizing companies to make the case for trusted 5G. He already set up meetings to strategically get their support and endorsements for the Clean Network's value proposition, and once we got that, we could amplify it on Brazilian TV before meeting with government officials.
Last night, I had a great dinner with 10 of the top Brazilian entrepreneurs. I also met with Fortune 500 companies that have big operations here from Germany, Japan, and the U.S. And, they said, look, we need these trusted networks to expand our operations. The entrepreneurs said, hey, we need this to protect our intellectual property.
The top Brazilian entrepreneurs and Fortune 500 companies carried a lot of weight with the government. Also during his visit, Krach strengthened their hand by bringing in Japan, one of the Clean Network's most powerful and staunch supporters, to hold the first ever Japan-US-Brazil trilateral dialogue. Later that day, on November 10, 2020, Brazil became the 50th member of the Clean Network, also the first one in South Latin America. Ecuador and Dominican Republic followed suit. By the time the baton was passed to the Biden administration, the Clean Network had reached 60 countries representing 2/3 of the world's GDP. It counted 200 telcos and industry-leading companies. Krach's team had proven that China Inc. is beatable, and in the process, exposed its biggest weakness, lack of trust. Remarkably, Huawei's vaunted 91 5G deals dwindled to less than a couple dozen outside of China. It had met all three of its objectives.
And with this really demonstrated what we were after in our three original objectives. The first one, of course, and the urgent one, was to prove that China Inc. is beatable by defeating the CCP's master plan to dominate 5G. We also knew that that would open up the playing field to enable U.S. entrants as well as our allies. The second objective was to deliver an enduring model for competing with China Inc. The third objective and final objective was to use 5G as an initial beachhead and a head start on building an alliance of countries and companies that could be leveraged for all areas of technological and economic competition, like clean infrastructure and clean energy.
Today, on the Eurasia landmass, China is building a more powerful network. A physical Belt and Road and a digital one. With the physical Belt and Road, the Chinese government loans money and sends Chinese companies to countries to help build their infrastructure. If the countries encountered problems with paying back the loans, their strategic ports and resources often would fall into the hands of the Chinese government. This strategy was later nicknamed debt for sovereignty.
When I first heard about the One Belt, One Road initiative, I was on my DocuSign listening tour in China. And it sure looked like a military supply chain to me. And then when I was running U.S. economic diplomacy, I actually witnessed China's insatiable appetite for raw materials, hard currency, and jobs. And I could see how that resulted in the equivalent of an invasion that attacks developing nations by siphoning their natural resources, bleeding their financial resources, and devaluing their human resources. And, this is why in November 2019, at the Indo-Pacific Forum in Bangkok, I launched the Blue Dot Network with Australia and Japan. And what this provides is a unified and equitable alternative to what one Asian economic minister called the One Belt, One Way toll road to Beijing. And the good news is that the Blue Dot Network operates by the same set of trust principles as the Clean Network. And the Biden administration aptly renamed it B3W. And what that means is build back a better world.
The Digital Belt and Road, on the other hand, is to build digital infrastructure in Europe and around the world, particularly through 5G deployment. 5G is the next generation of cellular networks composed of switches and routers and possesses the ability to accommodate vast exchanges of data required to power the majority of economic, civil, and military activities. Whoever builds the underlying switching systems will control the information flow passing through the network. A CCP-controlled 5G network will have profound national security implications as well as economic consequences for the world.
The physical and digital Belt and Road is a way for the CCP to build a China-centric network in which economic power is used as a tool of political coercion. To counter that, the synergy we achieved by combining the Clean Network and the Blue Dot Network with the same set of trust principles and also the same set of trust standards.
We provided a winning, bipartisan formula to the Biden administration, a global brand that's well positioned to challenge the CCP in every critical economic realm. The Wall Street Journal called the Clean Network an undisputed success and perhaps the most enduring foreign policy legacy of the last 4 years.
According to Bloomberg, Silicon Valley veteran Keith Krach harnessed the power of a network of nations to counter China, a notable change in tone after years in which the administration pursued a go-it-alone strategy, and further states the Clean Network's efforts to create a united economic front is to China what George Kennan's long telegram of 1946 was to the Soviet Union. 76 years ago, on February 22, 1946, George F. Kennan, an American diplomat who is considered to be the father of modern foreign policy, sent his famous 8,000-word-long telegram from the heart of Eurasia, Moscow, back to Washington. In it, he wrote, "The Soviet Union has a far-flung apparatus for exerting its influence in other countries, an apparatus of amazing flexibility and versatility, managed by people whose experience and skill in underground methods are presumably without parallel in history."
The advantage we had in defeating the Soviet Union during the Cold War was the U.S. private sector. One of the Clean Network's critical success factors was talking with telco and global CEOs and treating them like our own customers. This is quite unconventional in the government world, but it really worked.
However, there's only one problem. America's most powerful companies and institutions are still pouring money into China to make it thrive. In January 2020, Keith Krach brought Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Silicon Valley. They stayed there for 4 days.
The first night I had a dinner at my home, we had 36 of the top CEOs. You know, you'd recognize every single name, right? Everyone. And I had them all go around the room and tell their China horror stories. I stood up after everybody went around the room. I said, "Look, guys, we always, because all these guys are my friends, I go, we always see out here corporate responsibility, social responsibility. You know, corporate responsibility is also national security, because the Chinese Communist Party is a real and urgent threat, not just to our democracy, but to your businesses, because they don't want to just compete. They want to put you out of business. And they don't play by the rules." The world's kind of waking up. The Silicon Valley's coming along. The worst one is Wall Street. They're so conflicted.
The advantage of a totalitarian regime lies in that it has unlimited power and financial resources to do things. So when China Inc., backed by the world's second-largest economy, put the entire country's strength behind efforts like the Digital Belt and Road Initiative, hardly any isolated entity could compete with them.
During the pandemic, she really amped up China's Inc.'s practice of economic warcraft to build its military machine, erode our industrial base, and gain technological superiority. Unbeknownst, though, to most Americans, their investment accounts and pension funds are being used to finance Xi's grand plans. In addition, Chinese companies don't have to follow legitimate accounting rules like GAAP accounting. And for a guy who took 3 companies public, it's infuriating. But that's my personal issue. It's really about protecting the American investor and ensuring Chinese companies don't have the unfair advantage of not having to be transparent. And it's also about preserving the gold standard of the United States financial system. So in order to compete with China Inc., governments and companies need to draw a line in the sand on China Inc.'s abuse of the world's capital markets. We had a plan for this.